All right. Well, thanks for joining today. Eric, I saw that Kai posted on the Epic. I guess the Create team now owns the Visual Studio Code extension. That's sort of the premise for this whole meeting. So let me just double check
Yes,
it's
that is
correct.
accurate. Yes, you didn't get that wrong. Yeah, we are taking ownership of the extension as it very closely relates to the web IDE being powered by VS Code. And uh, for full transparency, we took his engineer that is the one that maintained the extension. So there wasn't really anybody left to maintain it. He's on our team now, so we took the extension with us.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, okay. Well, we have one engineer, Fernando, who's a front-end engineer. And it's looking probable that we'll have a number of milestones available here soon, and we would love to contribute to that extension to start to build in some secure features, because right now there's pretty much nothing at all as far as secure. You can't see any of your vulnerabilities. You can't, there's just nothing, right? Like the most you can do is you can see the status of your pipeline jobs and whether or not they've finished, but even monitoring to see like, oh, has my SAST scan completed, it doesn't give you any of the results from those scans. So um, our timeline here is a little bit short. We are hoping to have him start probably in 15.8. We don't necessarily have to have 100% of all of the mocks and everything fully done and designed by then, as long as I think, as long as we have like general agreement on notionally what's to be done, then um, we could probably have him get started and finish out some of the design work in parallel, I would assume. But yeah, I guess the main question would be, how can we best coordinate with your team? Um, do you have any thoughts or direction that we should be following here? I know in the past, Kai obviously had a lot of, pretty strong opinions about the extension. We're trying to mostly just find something that can be scoped small enough to fit in the time window that we've got available.
Yeah. Well, no, it's exciting, and I appreciate any contribution to it from other groups. I hope that this is the beginning of many other groups trying to integrate with the extension, because our general strategy right now is to replace the web ID with VS Code, and that's in progress. And then once we do that and we enable extensions, we're going to adapt the GitLab workflow extension to work on the web. There's just some sort of auth related changes to make it available on the web. And then once we do that, we get a consistent user experience between desktop and browser. And any features you build in are available in both. Um, we hope that folks like I've talked about it with the just with other groups. Pipeline editor, for example, could make an extension, an alternate editing experience within the extension, make that available on the desktop and web. Just an example. But I'm still in the early stages of ramping up, so I don't have as many strongly held opinions on how this should work and what the roadmap looks like. I do I do know that we just had a community contribution around seeing the status of running pipelines. So there may be something that we could look into tying into the experience there to show the security scans. Outside of that, I'm open to just about anything. And our engineer that you would want to touch base with on technical implementation is Tomas, and he's the one that has been maintaining it. He's generally the one that runs the extension. There's another engineer that's still on code review, but generally speaking, Tomas is the maintainer on the extension. He can walk you through the high level architecture of it, where the hooks are that you might need to
Okay.
tap into for this, and would be the one to review the MR ultimately, most likely.
Okay. Yeah, that's super helpful. Um, okay. Yeah, that all sounds great. And I definitely agree with that, overall vision of providing a consistent experience between web and desktop. I think that's a really good direction to head with everything. And I would say that that's generally in line and consistent with what my vision would be for secure features in the VS Code extension as well.
Mhm.
Um, there are a couple of challenges that we deal with, and I apologize, I didn't put all of this in the notes ahead of time. This sort of falls under my second point here of like allowing developers to see vulnerabilities from all the different types of scanners. But I just thought I might take a minute and talk through some of the challenges that we face with the secure scanners specifically, just to give you and really everyone in the call a little bit of context. So we have a
Mhm.
lot of different kinds of scanners. Our SAST and secret detection look primarily at the source code files itself. And so scanners like that would be a really good fit to actually run locally in the IDE. And many other security products out there do just that. Like they execute the security scans right there in the IDE. Especially some of the rules that are more just like linting rules make a lot of sense to just run right there as you're typing, and you can get almost immediate feedback if you're doing something that's not correct. But linting type rules are only one piece of all of the security scanning that's out there, and not everything can be done as simply as that. Otherwise it would just be one really big linter, and it certainly, security scanning is actually quite a lot more involved. And so some of our, on the other end of the spectrum, we have scans like our DAST and our fuzzing, that not only have to have something built, but they have to have it deployed and running somewhere where they're hitting the URLs of a web application, for example. They're throwing in randomly generated content. They're actually using the application itself in order to discover if there's a vulnerability there. And so obviously those are going to be really hard to run locally, if not impossible, because, again, like you would not only have to do a build, but you also have to deploy it somewhere. So, we run our CI/CD pipeline and we stand up a review app typically, and then we go scan the review app is normally the way that works. And then we have some scans that are in between, like our dependency scanning, which performs a build for some of the languages. It doesn't have to be deployed, but it does need a build. Or container scanning, you have to actually build the container image in order to scan it. Some of those we may be able to adjust the way they work to have them scan more of the source code instead of requiring a build. But there also may be trade-offs in that we may not be able to get the full scope of dependencies that are introduced without doing a full build. So what we end up having is this trade-off between having complete results and having fast results. And the solving that is really not an easy problem, in particular because there are other things to consider too, like we may have custom rule sets for SAST and secret detection, so it's not just one rule set. You would have to query out to GitLab to get the latest rule set and bring that in and scan it. And then you also have the issue of eliminating false positives or vulnerabilities that have already been dismissed, because some of the scanners can generate some noise. And if you've already reviewed, 95 out of 100 findings and found those to not be applicable, you wouldn't want those to continue to show up in the IDE. So if you've got that information in GitLab, you again need to like coordinate between the GitLab server and the desktop to make sure that you're only surfacing new vulnerabilities, or ones that are actually of concern. So there's a lot of complexity there, is really what I'm getting at when it comes to actually running the scanners. And so all this to say that my proposal is to defer our attempt to address that complexity and actually do the scanning locally, and instead just fetch the results of the vulnerabilities from the pipeline up in GitLab. And that way we can show everything. We can show DAST, we can show all of it. It just is going to take some time to fetch those results. So, the trade-off is the time to get a response. And I think we'll have to be careful in our UX design to communicate that, this really is whatever vulnerability view we create is really only going to be accurate as of the last completed pipeline, not as you're typing live. And so, that would be the one trade-off with that approach. But on the other hand, we won't have to worry about communicating, hey, this is only results for your secret detection and everything else is up in GitLab, right? Anyway, so there are really pros and cons both ways, but that was my initial proposal. At least we can adjust it if we need to, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on starting with just showing the results from the scans up in GitLab?
I mean, that I fully understand the challenges here, and I made some notes along the way, and mentioned that down the road, our remote development workspaces may
Mhm.
help in this regard with making the available. I know you're using review apps now, but making these ephemeral workspaces that can actually compile code on the web or remotely, via SSH. We could spin up one of those for a scan and be running them in real time. That means, well, that's a much longer roadmap, though. We're not going to have that in the next two milestones. So this sounds like a great iteration to at least make them available in the output, with the trade-off of, obviously, that you mentioned, is they're only accurate up to the last time the pipelines run. And if you make any changes locally, what do we do? How do we show that they're stale? Things like that. The UX around there could be a challenge. I guess I would turn around and ask, like, as far as defining the MVC, is that value your customers want? Even if they're stale, is it still providing the value? Are they going to be happy with that, or happy enough, happier than today with that iteration, or are they going to just only need it if it's live?
No, it absolutely will be an improvement on a number of fronts. I mean, just for one thing, they don't have to go out to GitLab just to see their vulnerability results, right? So anytime you minimize their need to context switch or go back and forth, they were going to have to wait for those results either way. And so
Mhm.
they may as well continue to code in their IDE while they wait for those to show up rather than having to go out and continually check the web.
Yeah.
So from a pure user perspective, it's valuable. And then, from like a sales market, landscape perspective, um, having anything at all in there is going to help our positioning because right now we don't have any security IDE story to speak of at
Mhm.
all, almost. I mean, like the most we can do is say, oh, look, you can see if your SaaS job is completed yet or not, right? That's like the most we can say. And so having something better of a story to tell there would be a huge, huge deal for us in the market.
Yeah. Well, also to Fernando's first question in here about the availability of the web versus desktop limiting feature parity, I think this iteration wouldn't limit that, because we're reading pipeline jobs, and if we can do that on the web, we can do that. Or if we can do that in both places, we're good. Where it comes down to being a bigger challenge with feature parity is when we start requiring builds and running environments for the scan. That would be dependent on the availability of some kind of remote workspace or review app that you can connect to. Which is not to say that eventually we won't get there, but for
Right.
if you were going to say that you were going to build DAST scanning locally, it just probably wouldn't show up in the web, because
Yeah.
it just, there's nothing to connect to. um I think it makes sense as a first iteration, and I think that given there already is insight into pipeline jobs running and being completed, there's some areas that we can tap into to kickstart that process from the UX standpoint. um and then, yeah, I believe there's plenty of fairly well documented APIs for how to, like, integrate with the editing environment in VS Code, and show line numbers and things like that that relate to the report.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the other thing to consider. And I'll spare you reading like the massive thread that is now there on that linked epic. But one of the big design decisions and engineering decisions that we need to make is where and how to display these results. So not all vulnerability results will have an associated file and line number. For example, those DAST scans, they're going out and they're scanning a URL endpoint, right? So that's not going to be able to map back to a line number or even a file, right? They're just scanning the running application as a whole, and really that maps back to a URL. Some results can map back to a line number in a file, and in that case, you're using that built-in IDE functionality to show like a squiggle or a problem, is great. But again, if we do that, we're only going to be able to show a subset of all of our scan type results. And so, do we rely on that problem tab in the Visual Studio Code IDE to show everything, but that's going to exclude, DAST and fuzzing and some others, or do we create our own, dashboard of sorts that can list it out? There are a few different security vendors have gone different directions in the market, and again, there are advantages and disadvantages of each. I assume that we'll probably want to do some sort of hybrid of both, because we definitely are going to want like that inline notation, but we probably also need somewhere to see something comprehensive. But
Mhm.
that would be an important design and engineering consideration as well as we start to get through this.
Let me share my screen real quick. I'm jumping right to solutions. It's terrible, but first of all, I want to highlight Julia's awesome new theme that I've been using. She's working on a new dark theme for our web IDE, and I'm using it locally. But so in the GitLab workflow extension, right? We have some, maybe the most obvious, if not easiest to implement, would be to have another panel, another section that's just like scan results. I see what you mean about the problems panel.
Mm-hmm.
It might be that certain scans show up in both or either or, depending on the relevance, but it does seem like there's space for it, right? Like it makes sense. We have a mental model right now for like essentially plan features and merge requests, and that's another panel. I think is the adding a view in there is not going to be terribly difficult. I don't have any pipelines running right now, but this is the latest pipeline. Yeah, I wasn't prepared for.
It's okay. I have a screenshot in the Epic I can link
Oh,
to.
okay, yeah, I don't have. Yeah, but
too.
yeah, I think that down here might be too hidden, and that you surfacing them here, especially like you said, if the output is more of a report than it is lines of code, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay, yeah, I'm very much on board with that, like notional design. Uh, I don't know, Michael or Julie, if you have any thoughts, or Fernando, but that seems like the right approach to me.
Yeah, I had very similar thoughts. I think that real estate that you talked about makes a lot of sense. It could even go as far as like obviously vulnerabilities relate to specific branches. So it could be a sub item under the current branch versus having a separate panel for it. But obviously we'll have to talk about the pros and cons and approach there.
Yeah, this is my unvalidated assumption, but I would expect that the developers would want to see the results for whatever branch they're currently on, because, when you're editing in Visual Studio Code, you only have one branch checked out at any given time. And so, I would expect that to just automatically update to whatever branch I'm on at that moment.
Yeah, but I see what you're saying, that we have that like for current branch, it might be like, vulnerability scan found,
Right.
or vulnerability report or something like that. rather than breaking out like a separate security panel for
Yeah.
everything to be contained. I mean, that's totally up to you, and the implementation may
I
change, like
was
you said, depending on the scan.
I was going to say, as a developer, we really don't even have a pipeline till we create an MR. So there's that other challenge. So for example, let's say I'm working on a new feature. The first thing I do is check out for master, right? And I'll do some development work, right? I'm not going to have any data to pull from until pipeline is run. So it's kind of like as I'm developing, I'm not going to have any data because usually putting up an MR is near the end of my process, or at least when I'm doing my first iteration of, putting something up. So like that's something to think about too. So if I'm working on something, then I think I'm ready to put up a merge request, let the pipeline run to maybe catch additional unit test failures. And then at that point, I'll, if any security things pop up, then I guess I could try to address that during my MR review process. But I don't think I would be seeing any of that in the initial development of the feature.
Yeah, that
That's
is
a good
a
point.
definite downside. Like until we're able to run some of these scans locally, I don't know how else you would even go about doing that, short of like pushing the code up for them and letting a pipeline run or something, you know? I mean, I suppose maybe there is some way to kind of hack it on the back end and actually do that. You know, maybe there would be some way to like not formally open a merge request, but still push the code up to GitLab and run a security scan only pipeline. I guess you still would have to do all the build and deploy steps. So you probably would have to run a full pipeline, but it seems like that also might not be desirable by some users because it would probably incur a lot of extra pipeline minutes if we were doing that automatically for them in the background.
Also, in that workflow that you were mentioning, Fernanda, is like you're starting on your main branch, right? And maybe you create a branch to start your work. You're not necessarily committing
Yeah.
at all, and you don't necessarily want to commit. You might be just trying something out. You don't necessarily, we can't presume that you intend this to be a merge request in its current form until you're ready to actually take that action. Maybe that's outside of my realm of expertise. I'm just spitballing.
Yeah, I think whatever we design, we would want to make sure that our design supported the ability to eventually run some of these scans locally so that you could get that more immediate feedback. You know, again, the downside is that running the scans locally, we're not going to be able to run all of the scans locally. So we could give you immediate feedback on SAST and secret detection and infrastructure as code, and maybe some dependency scanning as long as depending on the language. Anyway, so that'll be something to think about too with the designs. I think is just making sure that even though we're not developing all of that in this iteration, that we have a path forward and we're not designing ourselves into a corner so that we can have that more immediate feedback in the future for a subset of the scans. All right, well, that's all I have
Sounds
for
great.
today. Thanks for syncing up. Michael, you have time to work on this, I think, right, from a UX perspective. So I went ahead and created that design issue and assigned it to you.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. But yeah, we'll definitely keep you in the loop. Eric, you're the DRI now for this feature. So we'll look to you to approve whatever we come back with, and hopefully we can, contribute something in here and make some progress over the next few months.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks again for kicking this off.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks all.